Hi, I'm Alan Ehrenhalt, Executive Editor of Governing Magazine, and I am here with Bill Bishop. And the reason we're here is because he's written a terrific book called The Big Sort, which is about why people live near each other in America as opposed to the way they used to live. I wrote a review of that book, and Bill is here to talk about it, and we might branch off into who knows what that we don't even know anything about. But we're going to start with that, and Bill, tell us a little bit about you.
Hey, I'm but a simple journalist, Alan, living here in Austin, Texas. I was working for I worked at a little weekly newspaper in the mountains of Kentucky, and my wife and I owned a newspaper in rural Texas, and I worked as a columnist. But I came here about 8-9 years ago and hooked up with a sociologist, Robert Cushing, who is retiring from the University of Texas, and he provided all the stats work for The Big Sort, and which really he discovered the relationships in how we're living in city life, and which became the basis for the book.
And there was something about your neighborhood in Austin that put you onto all of this?
Well, my neighborhood is just a site. You know, my neighborhood is,
It's a bunch of liberals, basically.
Basically, I live about 4 blocks.
Liberals and dogs?
Well, you know, actually, when they do the, target marketing, Republicans own dogs and Democrats own cats. And so we do have a few dogs in the neighborhood. But I live about 5 blocks from where Jim Hightower lives, and I live about 4 blocks from where Molly Ivins used to live. And basically,
I'm afraid that stereotypes you for life.
Yeah, we wrote about 60 points off the Texas mean.
Right. And you noticed what? That there were people living 8 blocks away that voted, thought, bought, and did everything completely differently?
Well, I didn't normally cover politics in this sense. Bob and I were interested in why places like Austin and Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, and Boise, Idaho were getting richer back in the 1990s, around the turn of the century. And so we began doing these calculations with some other scholars on how those tech cities were different from other places. And we could see that people were sorting. People with education were accumulating in some places and not in others. Those places were creating lots of technology, lots of patents per person. And they were just zooming off in a different direction. But white people were leaving some places and going others. Black people were going one direction instead of another. Young people were leaving rural America and coming to these tech cities. And so somebody in the group said, you know, this is the big sort. And so we came at this by looking at the economy, not looking at politics.
There's something very odd about this. And that is, if I understand you right, you're saying that while America is becoming more diverse, it is also becoming more homogeneous.
Yes.
Or, if you want to be diabolical about it, segregated. Is that right?
Right, yeah. And what eventually Bob decided to look at was whether this sorting had political consequences. And so when he looked, he could see that over time, places at the county level were becoming increasingly either Republican or Democratic. And so when you begin to look around the country, you see incredible diversity locally between, from one locale to another, but increasing, as you described it, homogeneity within a place. So my neighborhood is totally homogeneous, and I go 60 miles away and I'll go into a town that is totally homogeneous, but utterly different from the place that I live.
So you cancel each other out, basically.
Right.
Go ahead.
Even without knowing the other exists, or just
right.
Knowing that it's they out there somewhere who are screwing things up for us, and of course they feel the same way.
I have to tell you that's the point that persuaded me. I have always been suspicious of clustering. Why now? Why are people doing this? Didn't we always cluster? Always been very skeptical of it. But your point, which was quoted to me by others and which I read in the book about, the number of so-called landslide counties, that is, and you can give me the numbers, and I don't remember them exactly, but in 1976, something like 25% of the counties in America went for Carter or Ford by more than 20 points, and in 2000 that was up to 50%, or maybe 2004. I found that a very hard statistic to explain away because you don't redistrict counties.
Right, and the phenomenon is really fractal. Precincts are tough because they change boundaries, unlike counties. But John Sides, who's now at George Washington, looked at Texas precincts for us over a 10-year period and saw the same phenomenon. So at precinct level, places were becoming more segregated. At the county level, they were becoming more homogenous, I should say. At the state level, in 1976, I think the average difference between Carter and Ford at the state level was about 8%. By 2004, it had grown to almost a little over 14% between Kerry and Bush. So, and at the congressional districts, which are gerrymandered, but even between gerrymanderings, those districts are growing more homogenous, either Republican. So it's everywhere. It's everywhere you look.
Well, let me be the devil's advocate for a minute. You've got this very fancy subtitle on your book. Why, let's see, I'm not sure I have it written down, but why the big sort is why Americans are dividing into clusters and why that is tearing us apart. Is it really tearing us apart? I mean, it's voluntary clustering. Can that really be tearing us apart?
Well, it's a subtitle.
I also know how publishers are, so, I mean, I don't hold you entirely responsible.
We wanted
would
Murder
you like to
in
defend
Miami,
that?
But somehow that didn't, that might have sold
Harem
more.
Girls of Baghdad, whatever,
It's interesting because the answer is locally, it's really reassuring. I mean, when you talk to social psychologists, they'll tell you that the most natural thing in the world is to try to find safety among people who are like yourself. And you're right, it has been part of history. Robert Wiebe, the historian, described America as a collection of island communities in the 1900s or 1800s, and so that's the kind of country we've had. What blew our mind was that it was increasing now when there was so much choice and there was so much mobility and so much opportunity to do exactly what you want. And what social psychologists will tell you is that, hey, given a choice, people will choose to be around others like themselves. And so that's exactly what we've done.
Well, that almost invites me to ask you questions about history, or at least to talk about history. And that is, what was immigrant America 100 years ago except a form of clustering? Right? I mean, we had in the big cities, we had Italian neighborhoods, Irish neighborhoods, Jewish neighborhoods. What's different about that from what's going on now?
Well, I think a couple of things. One is that the clustering now is lifestyle instead of class or ethnicity or religion, and so I think, and it's more voluntary. I mean, a lot of those neighborhoods, and certainly in the South, living patterns were enforced by a rough kind of law, and that's not true now. We're clustering according to the way we see ourselves and the way we want to live. The second difference is those clusters align with political party and with issues in ways that become dangerous when they're so truly aligned. I mean, in the North, we've been divided before, right? In the Civil War, there was just absolute geographic difference. But what we have now is that same kind of pattern where every issue falls either Republican or Democratic, and it then aligns with a geography that differs from county to county, and so you get this. I mean, it's really weird. I had a county commissioner in Oregon tell me that the anti-abortion people in his area no longer ask him about abortion; they ask him about property rights, and they know that his answer on property rights will predict what he thinks about abortion. So
these are proxy issues, essentially.
Right. And
one's a proxy for another.
As each new issue arises, old issues don't go away. new issues are added, and they fall into the same pattern as, property rights may define what you think about the war in Iraq, or how we should deal with Iran, or what you feel about immigration issues. All those things become and it's that kind of division that is troubling for a democracy.
Here's the problem I have with that, or at least here's the question I have about it. For a given period of time, one issue may be a proxy for another. But doesn't that change?
Yes.
The fact that gun control was a proxy for abortion in 2006 or 2004 tells us a lot about those years. Doesn't tell us anything about 2012. I mean, can't those things, since we're talking about sorting, resort themselves rather quickly and dramatically?
Yes, and that's the classic way that these kinds of geographic and party differences break down, is that some new issue will come up and will sweep away those old boundaries. We just haven't seen that issue yet. It seems like each issue that comes up finds its way into that Republican and Democratic pattern. I would have thought healthcare would have been one of those, right? But so far, we have people talking about Obama's socialist plan, and then whatever the answer is, from the Democratic camp for McCain's plan, whatever that might be. Even though outside of the parties, there's the beginning of that overlap, right? Because so you have Walmart cooperating with the Service Employees Union and GM on healthcare. So that may be the one. Something will sweep away these boundaries, but our lifestyle separation will remain because it's who we are and how we live.
Well, here's one. I mean, you're in Austin, but let's say it's Dallas or Houston. Are there neighborhoods of libertarians? If there are, I bet they're all against the war.
Right,
or most of them.
I would think yes, but they're not a lot of them. There's a couple of Ron Paul rallies.
If there were enough of them, Bob Barr would be about to become president, or Ron Paul, who's from Houston, by the way, right?
He is from between Houston and Austin. He's kind of down around that Gulf Coasty area.
Okay, let's say we're having a big sort. Who are the winners and who are the losers? Is it possible is that a fair question?
Yeah, because that's the way we began looking at this in terms of the economy, and the places that are winners are the places that collect people with BA degrees, and the distribution is becoming increasingly uneven. So Austin increases its, I think we now have 46% of the adult population has a BA degree, and I think Cleveland it's 17%. And the result is easily seen in the economy. Cleveland is one of the centers of the foreclosure crisis. Or I go to eastern Kentucky, my old stomping grounds, and it's the most incredible display of prescription drug abuse I think you could ever imagine. I mean,
meth mostly.
It's just this,
or OxyContin, that kind of thing.
I mean, you have literally questions about whether some cities even whether there's a need for them now. Because what also happened at the same time during the sort was that the returns to education economically increased. So that just exacerbated the economic differences caused by the collection of people with BA degrees in particular places.
I'm sorry.
No, so economically, the winners and losers are pretty easy to see because there's increasing regional economic inequality.
But you seem to believe that the sense of community is stronger in the declining places than in the successful places, which, if not a paradox, is at least a little bit puzzling.
Yeah, if you think about how that is, I mean, it doesn't seem fair, does it, that the places with the crappy civic culture should be the ones with the booming economies, and I know that's puzzled.
Did you say that was fair or unfair? Maybe that's just desserts. I don't know.
Well, if you think about it, if economies are increasingly built on new ideas, maybe the place with the loose culture is the place where the new ideas have a chance to bubble up and find their way into the economy. and so loose ties are more important than tight ties among people.
So let's take a look at a couple of places. I mean, this is very important to me. This is an important question. You know, where do the ties of community exist, and where they have frayed, how could we recreate them? So you mentioned Scranton, Pennsylvania. I mean, when you say that ties of community have persisted there, what do you mean exactly?
In Scranton?
Or Youngstown or Flint or any place like that.
Well, what Bob did was take Robert Putnam's data, and we looked at two groups of cities. We looked at the 21 tech cities, and we looked at the 130 or so cities with the least technology and produced the fewest patents. And you could begin to see this difference in way of life. I mean,
you're not getting a whole lot of patents out of Youngstown these days,
or out of Cleveland. Or it's not growing, and so what he found was that people in my neighborhood are less concerned about traditional authority. They don't volunteer as much. They don't go to church as much. They're less concerned with family. They're more active physically. They're more outward looking into the world. People in the low-tech cities they spend more time with family. They spend more time on community events. They're more adherent to traditional sources of authority. They go to church more. And so what's interesting to me politically is that the places with a tight social structure, which are good for organizing political campaigns, are the Republican areas. And so the Bush campaign realized that.
But now Scranton and Youngstown and Flint wouldn't be like that.
Well, they'd
be Democratic.
Be like that, but the low-tech areas in general have trended Republican. The high-tech areas are trending, with the looser cultures, are trending Democratic.
You take these so-called declining cities. I get the impression from reading you that people actually would be happy there. They just need jobs. They're reasonably happy with their life. They don't want to move. There just isn't anything for them to do there.
Right. The economy has stopped producing middle-class people. And, Jane Jacobs is all over this business. I mean, they'd be happy there, except that their society is dysfunctional, right? Economically dysfunctional, because it's not creating employment. It's not creating new work. And I think there's a good argument that it is in fact the tight social structure that keeps the place from creating new work.
And does that mean the converse is true, that high-tech centers are economically successful and socially dysfunctional, or at least anomistic?
Or at least they're socially different from what we had. I think this is where I'm interested in hearing what you've got to say, because the society that is being created, where we have these self-focused micro communities, demand a different kind of government, and so it's not good or bad. If we just thought about it as different, how does a place? I guess you have two different levels, and this is my question to you. You've got you've got states that are equally divided: Minnesota, California. In California, you've got some counties going off in the Republican direction, other counties going off in the Democratic direction, and the state legislature is a mess, isn't it? And
it's a terrible mess, although that has as much to do with referenda that have passed at the state level, I think, than with demographics. But I don't dispute you.
Right.
It is a mess.
And you also have then this almost a consumerist attitude towards democracy. Is that we expect stuff to be exactly the way we want it all the time. I've talked to the former mayor here, Kirk Watson, and when I tell them that marketing people have found almost a no compromise attitude among people in terms of products, they're not willing to compromise about anything. And he's just nodding his head, saying, "Yeah, that's what government is all about: is trying to make happy these people with vastly different ideas about what the world ought to be, but who are unwilling to compromise about the results."
Well, I have to think about that. I mean, what that implies for government. I'm tempted to respond that when you've got a political system in which candidates are bombarding voters all the time with the notion that government is failing them, possibly because it dared to increase their taxes by 1%, then everybody will have unreasonable demands on government, and it won't just be people in older declining areas or new high-tech areas. It'll be everybody, and that is a failing of the political system, not of American demography.
Well,
does that make sense to you?
Yes, except underlying this feeling is this incredible decrease in trust in government that is pushing everything that you described, which is part of. I mean, which does come from us, not from government failures or from. I mean, it's part of American life now that wasn't there 40 years ago. 50 years ago.
I think go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, 50 years ago. In 1966, I mean, in 1965, you had this the last burst of sort of government activity. You had the Medicare passed, and the first kids went to Head Start, and you had the National Endowment for the Arts and the Humanities was created, and the Voting Rights Act passed. And sometime around 1965, early 66, trust disappeared from the American landscape. People just didn't trust government to do the right thing anymore. Then the Great Society ended the next year, and we haven't had trust in government since. And that's the reason, I think, that we're seeing these kinds of government problems.
But of all the clusters that you can identify in this country, I bet you wouldn't find a cluster where people moved because they wanted to be with others who all trust the government a lot. Right? That's more of a societal phenomenon.
There wouldn't be enough to form a cluster.
I'm sorry?
I think that's the one thing liberals and conservatives have in common is that neither trust the government to do the right thing.
Yeah, if you want to be with people who distrust the government, you can live anywhere you want to. Well, let's talk about politics for a minute. One seems to me obvious corollary of all this is that red state and blue state is misleading, if not a fiction. What we're talking about is red wards, red precincts, blue precincts, right? I mean, we aren't nearly sophisticated enough in our color map or even in our understanding of where people are living on a partisan and ideological sense.
Right. Yeah, the states only make sense because of the electoral college. Otherwise, they're totally meaningless. Even though the states are trending, the states are trending more to have larger majorities for either Democratic or Republican candidates. That's why there's so few states out there waiting to be decided.
But you could easily have 15 razor-thin margins, states with razor-thin margins, in which the individual areas within those states were still mostly landslide counties.
Right, and you know what? And that's the interesting thing. This is what convinced me that the big sort was real, because we looked at the Obama-Clinton race, and that is a total. When we talked about 50% of the people, 49% of the people living in landslide county in 2004, in an extremely close election. Well, the Obama-Clinton race was even closer. 50% of the people lived in a landslide county.
So what does that mean? What does that tell us?
Well, it tells us that the division that we saw between Kerry and Bush, sort of ideological opposites, reappears when you have people who are ideologically the same. Because it's not the division isn't a question of political difference as much as it is difference in lifestyle and difference in where we want to live.
So when Morris Figurina, the political scientist, says the American people really don't differ that much on issues, that may be true, but they may differ so much by neighborhood or ward or county on cultural perceptions that they vote for Bush or Kerry on that basis, even if the issue distinctions are not that great, right?
Yeah, and I think the issue distinctions are that great, but I mean, there's a great political science argument that goes on that I'm certainly not qualified to get into. But yeah, I think it's not an issue. I don't think it's an issue difference as much as it is a way of life difference. So Obama went to Bristol, Virginia, the day after the primary. Bristol, Virginia went 64 or 5% for Clinton. It also went 64 or 5% for Bush in 2004. Exactly the same.
What does all this say, if anything, about Karl Rove's 2004 strategy of winning by protecting and maintaining your base as opposed to going for the moderates in the middle versus what appears to be the mantra of 2008, which is the election is going to be won in the middle? I mean, does the big sort tell us anything about which of those strategies makes sense for the coming years?
Well, the strategy that I think the Rove strategy, what Rove and Matt Dowd and those guys really understood in 2004 was that people vote for their community and that neighborhoods were switching in groups, not one by one. And so what you wanted to do was to have the campaign be an outpouring of support for the community in the form of the candidate. And so that's why they didn't, Kerry had MoveOn.org and all those, kids tromping through neighborhoods, and which did absolutely no good. The Bush campaign was built solely on local organization, neighbors talking to neighbors, neighbors having parties for neighbors. That you didn't have preachers telling people to go vote. They organized within the church, within leaders within the church, and that's the way people are going to vote. And even though Obama especially talks about this nonpartisan approach, I mean, when you look at the map of where his support comes, his support is just as limited as Kerry's was in 2004 in Obama's race against Clinton. He's really limited. He in the southern cities alone, in a 50-50 race, he was ahead of Clinton by nearly 1.5 million votes. I mean, that race is totally balkanized. He has not been able to break out of his city base.
But does that mean the race in November is going to be similarly balkanized, or is it really going to be one in the middle by people who see some virtue in either candidate and could conceivably vote either way? If so, that's a reversal of Rovism, and in some ways it seems to challenge the big sort.
Well, if there is a middle, we just did a poll for the Center for Rural Strategies and looked at rural voters in swing states, and there were between 4 and 8% people undecided. And I think that's normal. That's what all the polls are coming up with. It was an extremely low. I mean, do you know people does anybody know anybody who's undecided who they're going to vote for in November?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
but I may not know a very representative sample of people.
Huh. Well, yeah.
In fact, I definitely do not know a representative sample of people. So it doesn't seem impossible to me that small a percentage of the electorate is undecided. But if so, that seems to me to have very large implications. That Rove Dowdism is not dead at all, and in fact, the sorting of America into clusters might enhance it because you'd be inclined to vote with the people you live near to and who looked and thought like you. Even if you weren't sure in the beginning, you'd say, well, everybody I know is voting for McCain
right.
or Obama, so I will too, and the middle would shrink even further.
Right. I think that's, and I think you can see that in the polls already. I think there was a 12% increase in McCain's take among white evangelicals from April to May. The chickens are coming home. And so the question is, can Obama move out of the cities, and can McCain move back into the cities? Can McCain capture those suburbs that have been trending more Democratic? And so it explains perfectly why he's tromping around in the forest out west talking about global warming, and in the Everglades. He's trying to recapture those people in suburban America who think that maybe the planet's getting warmer for a reason, and that maybe we should do something about it. And then, as I said, Obama goes to Bristol, Virginia, to try to recapture that rural ex-urban vote that the Democrats haven't been able to get since 1996.
Let's talk about the suburbs for a minute. In Northern Virginia, where I live, it's kind of interesting the way things have developed. In my suburb of Arlington, that was once Republican, but it's been Democratic for 20 years.
Right.
The Republicans used to say, well, we've lost Arlington, but at least we have Fairfax. That's got 1 million people. That's sort of middle suburbia, 50s, 60s suburbia. Well, then they started losing Fairfax.
Right.
And they said, well, that's not good, but we've got the outer county. We got Loudoun and Prince William. We've got the outer suburban counties, so we'll still win. And in the last couple of elections, they've lost those.
Right.
And there just aren't enough votes for Republicans to win outstate if they lose the cities, the inner suburbs, the middle suburbs, and the outer suburbs. Those elections are gone. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen this year, but similar things have happened in Pennsylvania. You mentioned Colorado in your book as a state in which migration has affected the suburbs. I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, Bob, you can track people where they come from and where they go using IRS records, and you could see that the people who were moving to Colorado, largely, especially to Boulder and Denver, were largely coming from blue counties. L.A. County, I think, was the largest contributor of people to Colorado over the last 20 years, and they weren't going to rural areas. So rural parts of Colorado were becoming more Republican, while urban parts of Colorado were becoming more Democratic, so the state was getting purplier because of migration. And so the state becomes competitive, but then I keep thinking, God, within the state, they're going to have some of these problems of governing that because it's all of a sudden this competitive, this balkanized kind of polity between city and countryside, and so it's just I think it's really the governing question for now. How do we govern among diverse populations who don't know each other, and among legislators who represent districts that are increasingly segregated and lopsided?
Well, in the suburbs, I think you've got another phenomenon, which is the conventional business chamber of commerce-oriented, affluent suburbanite being turned off by the social right in the Republican Party.
Right.
And you get a schism in the Republican Party that is not in kind, but in degree, in depth, similar to what afflicted the Democratic Party in the 1960s when segregationists from Mississippi and leftists from New York were going to conventions together. I mean, it's the Republican Party that seems to me to face that issue now, regardless of how they're sorted out. You have these suburbs that are trying to decide if they're Republican in the conventional sense, or if they're so alienated by Republicanism in the social, religious, moral sense, they're going to vote for Democrats from now on. Now, would they vote for Obama? I don't think we know the answer to that question.
Right. But that's the election. I mean, that defines the election. And then I think
that's why we have them, isn't it?
And I think there's another thing that goes on. If McCain is too much of the environmentalist or too much of the immigrationist sort of moderate in order to capture those suburbs that Republicans have lost, will he lose on the other end? And if Obama makes inroads in rural or ex-urban areas, will he turn off his constituency in the cities?
What I get from that is that we have the potential for a cross-cutting election in 2008 that we did not have in 2004 and may not have had in quite a while, and the big sort may resort itself in some way politically.
Well, yeah, I mean, but I haven't. I think I've seen it more with McCain than with Obama, right? I mean,
yes.
Don't you think?
So far,
yeah. I mean, what have been the entrees to Republican areas from the Obama campaign?
Let me ask you one last large question about all this. I am persuaded that the big sort is taking place in a lot of areas in this country. Is it a phenomenon of the first decade of the 21st century? Is it an aberration or an interlude? Or are we talking about something that is going to determine American culture and politics for the next generation? Is there any way to know that? Do you have any thoughts about it?
Well, I think we know that what we've seen is a rise of self-expression as being the paramount concern of everyone. So people buy Priuses because they, more than half people buy Priuses, buy them because they tell something about themselves. We make purchases, we live in neighborhoods, we buy houses, we have cars and clothing that express ourselves. And that's, I think, the way we live and will continue to be the way we live. And that sort of self-expression will continue to push people into neighborhoods where they can get the stuff they want and be around the people they want to be around. And so that phenomenon will continue, whether it continues to align with political parties so exactly, that's the political question. There's one other thing, though. With a new generation of younger people are, to me, I think, less concerned with these boomer questions of left and right and wrong. And you can see that in the emerging church, which we talk about in the book. Very biblically oriented churches, but not without the, as some of the kids tell me, thou shalts and thou shalt nots of the mega church. And so there may be a generational change and an attraction among younger people to institutions and politicians who don't profess to have the right answer all the time. And I think that is Obama's appeal among younger people.
It's not outrageous, is it, to assume or at least speculate that we might continue to sort ourselves out into clusters culturally, but face cross-cutting elections that go across this cultural divide and produce not only unpredictable but perhaps unusual political results without in any way disturbing the fact that we are continuing to undergo a cultural big sort.
Right. And then what happens when gas prices get so high that sprawling suburbs are no longer feasible and people have to move in closer together? Does that begin to mix things up? I think there are all sorts of big issues that could mix up the pot. I think the way we live, though, is going to remain the same, but the politics will change. I hope.
I think that's a good note to end on.
Okay.
Bill, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. It's great to talk to you.
It's been fun.
Okay. Bye.
See you later.